Karen screamed about my fake disability. Didn't know I was the guest speaker. I never expected my day to start with someone screaming at me for sitting down. I'd arrived at the community center early that morning, giving myself plenty of time before the awareness event started. The parking lot was already filling up, but I managed to find a handicapped spot near the front. I always feel a twinge of anxiety when I get out of my car, mostly because I know how it looks to others. I don't use a wheelchair. I don't have a service dog. From the outside, I look young, healthy, and capable. But what people don't see is the nerve damage in my right leg, the way it constantly feels like I'm wadding through concrete every time I take a step, or how I've spent years dealing with a degenerative condition that makes it harder and harder to get through a normal day. That morning was one of the bad ones, where my joints ached with every movement, and the fatigue in my body didn't match the rest I thought I'd had the night before. I leaned heavily on my cane as I walked through the front doors, nodding at the event staff and checking in at the desk. They recognized me instantly, greeted me with a smile, and pointed me toward the front of the auditorium. I was one of the guest speakers, scheduled for the main presentation. But even if I hadn't been, they were kind and professional and didn't question my right to be there. I made my way to the front row, sat down carefully, and adjusted the cushion I'd brought for support. I pulled out my notes and tried to get comfortable. The lights overhead were bright, the hum of conversation slowly growing as more attendees filtered in. I focused on my breathing, trying to settle my nerves before I had to speak. I wasn't nervous about public speaking. I'd done it dozens of times, but the weight of carrying other people's judgment, the way eyes scanned me up and down when I moved or sat or winced, it always wore me out before I ever said a word. I was lost in thought when I felt a shadow fall across me. Looking up, I saw her. Mid-50s maybe, wearing a thick coat and far too much perfume, hair pulled into a tight bun that screamed authority. She had the unmistakable energy of someone who had appointed herself the keeper of rules. Beside her was a woman who looked less confident, maybe a friend or coworker. Karen, yes, that's what I'll call her, glared at me with pursed lips and hands on her hips. "You're in the VIP section," she said, her voice loud and sharp enough to turn a few heads nearby. "Those seats are for invited guests only." I blinked. "I know," I replied calmly, gesturing to the event badge hanging from my lanyard. "I'm one of the speakers." Karen narrowed her eyes, not even bothering to look at the badge. "Sure you are, and I'm the Queen of England." She gave a sarcastic laugh as though I were a child caught sneaking into a restricted area. "These seats are reserved for people who actually belong here, not people pretending to be sick to get perks." For a second I didn't respond. I've had run-ins like this before, but each time still stung. The disbelief, the accusations, the refusal to consider that someone might be struggling with something invisible. I could have just let it slide. I could have stood up and walked away. But I was tired. Tired in every way, physically, emotionally, mentally, and I wasn't in the mood to play nice. "I'm not pretending," I said, my voice still steady. "I have a disability." "Oh, give me a break," Karen snapped. "You walked in here just fine. You look fine. You can't just sit in a reserved seat because you feel like it. I've seen people like you before, always looking for attention." I looked around. A few people were watching, but most were pretending not to. The woman next to Karen looked like she wanted to disappear. I shifted in my seat, trying not to grimace as a jolt of pain shot through my lower back. "I'm allowed to sit here," I said again, firmer this time. "Please don't make a scene." That, of course, was the wrong thing to say. Karen's voice rose immediately. "Oh, I'm making a scene. You're the one faking a disability to steal seats from real disabled people. If you can walk, you can stand. So stand up and let someone who actually needs it sit down." There it was. The sentence I'd heard too many times in too many places. If you can walk, you're not really disabled. As if disability fits neatly into their little boxes of what it should look like. As if pain, exhaustion, and struggle don't count unless you're in a wheelchair or unconscious. "I'm not moving," I said quietly, gripping my cane. Karen scoffed and turned toward a nearby staff member. "Excuse me, can we get some help here? This person is refusing to move out of the VIP section and is clearly lying about being disabled." The young staff member looked startled, glancing from me to Karen and back again. I think. "She's not even trying to hide it," Karen continued, cutting her off. "This is disgusting. People like her make it harder for real disabled people to be taken seriously. She's just lazy and entitled." I took a deep breath, heart pounding. I could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. It didn't matter how many times this had happened, I always felt it. That mix of anger and helplessness, that aching urge to defend myself when I shouldn't have to. I was about to open my mouth when someone else appeared, one of the event coordinators. A middle-aged man with a clipboard, rushing over with a look of concern. "Is everything okay here?" he asked. Karen immediately launched into her performance. "This young woman is pretending to be disabled so she can sit in the reserved seats. I'm sure you don't want scammers like this ruining your event." The coordinator turned to me. "Oh, there you are, we've been looking for you," he said with relief. "We're starting in 10 minutes. Come with me, please." Karen's mouth fell open. I stood slowly, leaning on my cane, and gave her a neutral look. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to get ready for my talk." And with that, I walked right past her. The walk backstage was quiet, the kind of heavy quiet that clings to your shoulders even when the noise of the crowd hums just behind it. I could still feel Karen's eyes burning into the back of my head as I moved, and every step I took felt twice as hard, not just from the pain that had never quite left me, but from the emotional weight of what had just happened. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what her expression would be. Shock, embarrassment, maybe even fear now that she realized she'd yelled at someone who wasn't just a stranger but someone with a voice, someone whose name was printed in the program she probably hadn't even bothered to read. The coordinator, whose name I remembered was Michael, led me through the curtain and into the prep room behind the stage, handing me a bottle of water and checking the mic levels. He didn't bring up the incident, didn't ask questions, but I could see something flicker in his eyes, like he'd caught the tail end of what went down and didn't want to make it worse by bringing it up. I appreciated that. Sometimes silence is its own form of respect. I took a few moments to breathe, drinking slowly and reviewing my cue cards, even though I knew the content by heart. I've been doing this kind of advocacy work for a while now, ever since I stopped pretending everything was fine and accepted that my story might help others feel a little less invisible. It wasn't about being inspirational or collecting sympathy. It was about being honest, raw, and real in a world that's too quick to judge what it can't see. That morning, more than any other, felt like the universe had handed me the perfect example of why I was doing this in the first place. Still, my hands trembled a little as I adjusted the mic. No matter how many times I told my story, it never got easier. But maybe it wasn't supposed to. Maybe if it started feeling too easy, too rehearsed, then I wouldn't be reaching anyone anymore. Back in the auditorium, the MC was wrapping up their opening remarks, thanking sponsors, highlighting the importance of understanding, and hinting at the stories that would be shared today. I could hear the polite applause, the creak of chairs as people shifted, and I wondered if Karen had figured it out yet. I wondered if she realized who I was. I didn't expect her to apologize. People like that rarely do. But part of me hoped, maybe foolishly, that watching me take the stage might shake something loose in her, some flicker of self-awareness, some tiny crack in her wall of arrogance where the light of humility might shine through. Or maybe not. Maybe she'd spend the rest of the event sulking, arms crossed, muttering to herself about how I was exaggerating everything for attention. That was out of my hands now. The MC's voice lifted, cheerful and proud, as they announced my name and invited me to the stage. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, and full of curiosity. I stepped through the curtain, my cane tapping softly against the floor, and looked out into the crowd. It was a full house. Rows upon rows of people, young, old, professionals, students, all watching as I made my way to the podium. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let it show. I scanned the audience and saw her, sitting halfway back, her posture stiff, her eyes wide and blinking like she was trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Our eyes met for a split second, and I gave her nothing. No smile, no glare, just the same calm expression I'd given her earlier. Then I looked away and addressed everyone else. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady through the microphone, though my hands still trembled slightly out of sight. "Thank you for being here. My name is Lily, and I live with a disability that you can't always see. And that's what I want to talk about today, what it means to live with something that isn't immediately visible, what it means to be doubted, judged, or dismissed, not because you're not in pain, but because that pain doesn't make itself obvious to others." The room grew quiet in that special way that only comes when people are really listening, not just hearing words, but listening. I told them about the years of misdiagnosis, of being told it was all in my head. I talked about the days when walking from the bed to the kitchen felt like climbing a mountain. I shared how exhausting it was to constantly be performing normalcy just to avoid comments, how people told me to push through it, like it was a matter of willpower. I explained how even well-meaning friends would say, "But you don't look sick," and how that sentence, though often meant as encouragement, felt like an erasure. I wasn't here to shame people for their ignorance. I was here to expose the cost of that ignorance and invite them to do better. As I continued, I didn't even have to reference what happened earlier. The irony spoke for itself. The audience, especially those who'd witnessed it, knew exactly what had taken place. I could see it in their faces, the slow dawning of awareness, the subtle nods, the occasional glance back toward where Karen sat. And while I never said her name or pointed her out, the story had already taken root. It didn't need to be spelled out. People were connecting the dots. When I wrapped up the first half of my talk, the silence was deafening. For a second I thought they were stunned into stillness, but then the applause erupted, loud, extended, rising to a standing ovation from nearly half the crowd. My chest tightened, not from pride, but from the sheer relief of being heard. Not doubted, not second-guessed, heard. And for once in this moment I wasn't being questioned or challenged or accused. I was simply being accepted. The power of that, especially after the way the day began, nearly brought me to tears. As I stepped away from the podium and returned behind the curtain, Michael gave me a small nod and a quiet, "You nailed it." I leaned back against the wall and finally let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline was wearing off and the pain in my body returned like a tidal wave. But I didn't mind. I'd said what I came to say. And as I sat down, sipping water and trying to decompress, I realized the moment wasn't over yet. Because Karen, whether she liked it or not, had just heard every word. And now the question was what she would do with it. After the applause died down and I disappeared behind the curtain, I let my body sink into the nearest chair backstage. My legs were already aching from the effort of standing, walking, and standing again, but it was the kind of ache I was used to pushing through. What lingered more than the pain was the emotional toll. Sharing my truth in a room full of strangers always came with a strange cocktail of exhaustion and adrenaline. My hands were still trembling slightly, not from nerves anymore, but from the aftershocks of reliving years of frustration and invalidation. I sipped the water Michael had brought me earlier, trying to refocus. The crowd was still murmuring beyond the curtain. The energy in the room changed from casual chatter to something quieter, more reflective. I didn't need to hear what they were saying to know that the story had resonated. I had watched it happen in real time. The shifting postures, the stillness, the eye contact. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat Karen, who, until just minutes ago, had loudly and publicly accused me of being a fraud. I hadn't seen her leave. I wondered if she was still in her seat, too stunned or embarrassed to move. Part of me didn't care, honestly. I hadn't done any of this to get some kind of revenge. I didn't walk on that stage to humiliate her. I hadn't even planned to mention the incident when I was preparing my notes. But life, as it often does, served up a painfully relevant example just before I was set to speak, and ignoring it would have felt dishonest. Still, I'd kept it vague, general, neutral. I didn't want this to be about her. I wanted it to be about all the Cairns of the world. The ones who look at someone like me and decide with zero context or compassion that they know better, that they've seen enough to judge, that their gut feeling outweighs years of my medical records and daily struggle. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. And even if Cairn had taken my words personally, well, that wasn't something I could control. A few minutes passed in a haze of backstage activity. Staff members moved around setting up for the next speaker, volunteers carried in trays of refreshments, and Michael came by again to ask if I needed anything. I waved him off with a tired smile. I was fine, or at least as fine as I could be after the kind of emotional vulnerability I just poured into a microphone. The next portion of the event wasn't until after a short break, so I figured I'd take advantage of the time to rest and maybe stretch my leg a bit. I was just about to head to the green room when I heard someone call my name, a woman's voice, hesitant, awkward. I turned and there she was. Cairn stood just inside the backstage area, fidgeting with the strap of her oversized purse, looking smaller than before, not physically but in her energy, her posture, her presence. Gone was the blustery arrogance, the loud self-importance. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and her face wore an expression that was equal parts shame and uncertainty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked like she was trying to find the right words, maybe even questioning whether she should have come back here at all. I stayed seated, not to make a point, but because my body simply didn't want to get up again. I raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting. I didn't know, she said finally, her voice much softer now. I didn't know you were the speaker. I didn't realize. I let the silence hang there, not because I wanted her to squirm, but because I wanted her to really think about what she was saying. Not knowing I was the speaker wasn't the point, and we both knew it. She made her assumptions long before that. She cleared her throat and tried again. I mean, I didn't know you were actually disabled. I thought you were just, sitting there for convenience or something. I took another sip of water, keeping my expression neutral, because I didn't look how you thought I should look. She winced and I could tell the words had hit. Yeah, she admitted, almost whispering. I guess that's what it was. I've just never really thought about invisible disabilities before. I mean, I've heard of them, but I didn't think. She stopped herself again, clearly struggling. I watched her closely. There was no satisfaction in seeing her like this. No victory. Just the exhausting reminder of how many people still needed to unlearn what they thought they knew. It's not your job to diagnose people in public, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. You don't get to decide who is worthy of kindness and who isn't based on how they look when they sit down. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if agreeing would erase what had happened. I know, I'm sorry, I really am. I was out of line. I was just so sure, and now I feel terrible. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. Cairn. Her eyes widened a little at the name, but she didn't interrupt. You don't need to apologize to me because I turned out to be a speaker. You need to apologize because you treated a stranger like garbage based on your assumptions. If I hadn't been on stage today, would you still be sorry? She hesitated, and the pause told me everything. She hadn't thought about that, or maybe she had and she didn't like the answer. Eventually, she nodded again, this time slower. You're right, she said. I'm not going to pretend I would have changed my mind if I hadn't seen you speak. I guess I never really realized how deep my own biases were until now. That was something, at least. I didn't let her off the hook, but I didn't need to keep her there either. I wasn't a teacher and she wasn't my student. I wasn't obligated to hold her hand through her growth. She had come to her realization, however messy and late, and now it was up to her what she did with it. Well, I said finally, standing with effort and gripping my cane again, I hope you carry that realization with you outside this auditorium. Because there are a lot of people like me walking around getting judged for things we didn't ask for. And the next time you feel that judgment coming up, maybe pause and ask yourself why. She nodded, her face flushed but thoughtful. I will. Thank you for not yelling at me. I deserved it. I gave a small shrug. I'm not here to punish people, I'm here to tell the truth. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her thoughts, her regrets, and hopefully her growth. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The rest of the event carried on with the quiet intensity that often follows a story people didn't realize they needed to hear. As I sat backstage, listening to the next speaker begin their segment, I allowed myself a moment to let the tension melt away from my shoulders. My legs still throbbed, but the pain had become background noise again, like a familiar hum I'd trained myself to function with. My thoughts wandered back to the conversation I just had with Cairn, and I found myself sitting in a swirl of conflicted feelings. There was no denying that what she had said and done to me had been awful, loud, humiliating, baseless. And yet, a part of me couldn't help but recognize the look in her eyes when she realized the depth of her mistake. It hadn't been defensive or fake. It had been real, frightened, self-conscious, and a little cracked open. That mattered, even if I wasn't ready to let it redeem her completely. After another 30 minutes of programming, the break began, and the audience filtered out into the wide lobby for coffee, muffins, and conversation. I'd only just emerged from backstage when the wave of people began. A few recognized me immediately and approached with warm expressions and genuine praise. Some shook my hand. Others shared stories of family members, spouses, or even their own battles with invisible conditions. There was something raw in the way they opened up, as if hearing someone describe a pain so similar to their own had loosened something buried deep inside. I listened carefully, nodding, sometimes offering a few words in return, other times just being the silent recipient of their need to be heard. It was always like this after I spoke, an outpouring that proved to me again and again how many people were carrying unseen weights, just hoping someone would believe them. In the middle of the crowd, I saw Cairn again. She hadn't left after our conversation, which surprised me a little. She stood by the coffee table, holding a paper cup like it was the last piece of normalcy she could cling to. Her friend from earlier was beside her, whispering something into her ear that made her glance my way. Our eyes met, and for a split second she looked like she might come over again. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded once, a small, respectful gesture, and turned away. I let her go. That was enough. Sometimes the smallest signs are the most meaningful. I didn't need a repeat of our earlier interaction. I didn't need her to grovel or perform a second apology. She'd shown me more with that quiet nod than she could have with 1,000 words. That I could accept. I found a chair in the corner of the room, near a tall window that looked out onto the parking lot. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long streaks of light across the tile floor. I stretched my legs out slowly, careful not to draw too much attention to the act of grimacing as I did so. A young woman in her 20s, wearing thick glasses and an oversized sweater, sat down beside me with a gentle smile. She'd been in the audience. I remembered her face from the front rows. "Hi," she said softly. "I just wanted to thank you. It was powerful." I gave a small smile in return, dipping my head in appreciation. "I'm glad it meant something to you." She hesitated before speaking again. "I have lupus. Most days people tell me I look fine, but I'm not. I'm never fine, and no one ever says it out loud the way you did. That disconnect, the invisibility of it." My heart twisted a little, the familiar ache of recognition. "It's a lonely kind of pain, isn't it?" I said gently. "To constantly feel like you have to defend your suffering, like people won't believe it's real unless you're visibly broken." She nodded, eyes damp. "Exactly that." I didn't try to offer her advice. I didn't say it gets better or that she should stay strong. Instead, I just sat with her in that quiet corner, sharing the space of mutual understanding. Sometimes that's all we really need, to know that someone else has been through the fire and still keeps walking, that the isolation isn't permanent, that we aren't alone. The remainder of the break was filled with more moments like that, short conversations, gentle acknowledgments. I saw people connecting with each other across the room, sparked by the stories that had been shared. There was a warmth to the space now, a softness that hadn't been there when the morning began. Events like these were meant to raise awareness, but every now and then they transformed into something deeper, shared humanity. And I felt it radiating through the conversations, the body language, even the way people looked at each other now. There was less judgment, more curiosity, less posturing, more openness. Later, during the final panel discussion, I joined 3 other speakers on stage to answer questions from the audience. The topics ranged from accessibility in the workplace to how to support friends with chronic conditions. I answered honestly, trying to avoid the cliches and empty platitudes that so often fill these kinds of sessions. One question came from a man who stood up and admitted that he'd never thought twice about people who parked in handicapped spots but didn't use wheelchairs. He said my story had made him realize how quick he was to judge what he couldn't see, that he wanted to do better, and I believed him, not because he said the right thing, but because of how uncomfortable he looked admitting it. Growth, I've learned, rarely looks graceful. It usually comes with stammering words and flushed cheeks. As the event wound down and people began to gather their things, I felt a calm settle over me. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close. A moment of emotional clarity that comes from knowing you did something that mattered, not just for yourself, but for others. I hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson today, and I certainly hadn't planned to become an example in the middle of the coffee-stained chaos of the real world. But sometimes the story writes itself, and all you can do is step into it honestly and tell the truth. I left the building slowly, leaning into my cane, the weight of the day pressing into my bones in that familiar, aching way. The parking lot had thinned, but the sun was still out, and the sky was painted with that golden haze that makes even the most painful days feel a little softer around the edges. As I unlocked my car, I paused for a moment and looked back at the building. Karen was nowhere in sight, but her presence still lingered in my mind, not as a villain, but as a symbol of something larger. Of a world still learning, of people still waking up, and maybe, just maybe, of one woman who might think twice the next time she opens her mouth to judge a stranger. That, I decided, was enough for today. The drive home was quiet, save for the occasional hum of tires rolling over asphalt and the faint buzz of the radio turned low, more a background murmur than a source of sound. I didn't really hear it. My thoughts were elsewhere, playing back the entire day like a film on loop. Every step into the building, every word hurled at me, every stare that lingered too long, and finally, every face in the crowd that shifted from skeptical to silent as I spoke. The emotional weight of it all settled over me in layers. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt more than anything was tired in the way that goes beyond physical limits, the kind of tired that lives in your bones when you've spent years defending your own existence. But beneath that exhaustion was something softer, something that felt like relief or maybe release. Because despite everything that happened, I'd stood my ground. I had spoken not only for myself, but for countless others who didn't get the chance, and that mattered. At a red light, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older than it had that morning, not in a dramatic or aged way, but in the subtle creases of my eyes, the tautness around my mouth. It was the kind of change you couldn't see unless you knew what to look for, an invisible shift, much like the things I'd spent the entire day explaining to a room full of strangers. I wondered how many of them would go home and remember what I said. I wondered how many would brush it off within hours, falling back into their old assumptions. But even if only a few truly carried the lesson forward, even if just one person changed how they saw someone in pain, then the energy I'd spent was worth it. I didn't need applause or a trophy or a headline. I just needed people to see the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it came wrapped in awkward silences and quiet realizations. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting everything in that rich golden hue that makes even the most ordinary places look like a dream. My house, small and familiar, stood quiet and waiting, its porch light flickering on as I stepped out of the car. I moved slowly, each motion deliberate, every joint protesting the long day. My cane tapped the ground rhythmically, the sound oddly comforting now, like a metronome guiding me toward the solace of home. Inside, I was greeted by the gentle stillness of the space I'd carefully crafted to suit my needs. Nothing flashy, just warm lighting, soft furniture, and enough space to move without strain. I set down my bag, peeled off my shoes, and sank into the couch with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs. I didn't turn on the television or check my phone right away. Instead, I sat in that silence and let the day settle, the speeches, the nods of agreement, Karen's strained apology, the young woman with lupus, the man who admitted his blind spots aloud in front of a crowd, the applause that followed my story, not because I had wowed them with theatrics, but because I had spoken a truth they needed to hear. Each memory floated through me like pages in a book, some heavy with pain, others fluttering softly with meaning. And somewhere in that mental scrapbook was the version of me from that morning, smaller, maybe a little nervous, uncertain if the words I carried would land. I thought about her and smiled gently, because she hadn't let the noise drown her out. Eventually, I picked up my phone. There were messages waiting, texts from friends who had attended or watched the event live-streamed online, messages from strangers who had found my name afterward and wanted to share their own stories. I scrolled through them slowly, reading every one. Some were simple thank yous. Others were long and detailed, full of stories from people who, like me, had suffered in silence for far too long. Parents of chronically ill children, workers who had been denied accommodations, teenagers who felt like they were already failing because they couldn't keep up with their peers. Each message was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that the things I'd said had made ripples. One message stood out. It was from an email address I didn't recognize, but the subject line was short and direct. I heard you. Curious, I opened it. The message was brief, just a few sentences, but I knew instantly who it was from. I want you to know I've been thinking about everything you said. I was wrong to judge you, and I'm even more sorry now than I was earlier. I talked to my friend on the drive home, and she told me about someone in her life who's been struggling with chronic illness too. I never really listened to her before. I think I get it now. I hope I can be better moving forward. Thank you for being patient with me when I didn't deserve it. There was no signature, no name, but I didn't need one. The words were enough. The fact that she'd carried the experience beyond the walls of that auditorium into her drive home, into a conversation with someone close to her, that was more than I could have hoped for. Growth wasn't linear, and people like Karen didn't change overnight, but that small step mattered. And it didn't come because I shouted or demanded it. It came because I stood firm in my truth and let it speak louder than anger ever could. I closed my phone and set it down gently on the table. Outside the window, the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the kind of deepening sky that promises rest. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything and still breathe easy. I didn't need to explain myself anymore, not to strangers, not to skeptics, not to the next Karen who might come along. I had done what I could. I had spoken clearly, carried the message forward, and planted the seeds of understanding. What grew from there wasn't up to me. In a world that moves too fast, that often forgets the quiet, slow battles people fight each day, I had chosen to be visible, not for recognition, but for truth. And sometimes, truth is all you need to make someone stop, think, and maybe, just maybe, change.